Welcome to this BrightSign webinar. We've entitled it BrightSign 101, the idea being to address topics relating to bringing up a BrightSign player for the very first time. We intend this presentation for folks who have a new BrightSign player but have very little or no experience getting a player going, and our intention is to cover the very basics. Admittedly, there's a lot we could talk about. There are many advanced topics and capabilities. We're going to save those for a future webinar, and we'll be interested in your suggestions as to the topics we should cover. Please feel free to send an email to sales@brightsign.biz, and we'll make sure to add your suggestions to our list. But in the meantime, our topics are the following for today. Put yourself in the role of someone who just received a BrightSign player for the very first time, and the question is, now what? So in this webinar, we're going to cover the following 5 topics: player basics, just some very basic overview information about the different players we offer. We'll talk about installing the BrightAuthor application and configuring that application for first use. We'll talk about configuring a player for first use. Then we'll talk about putting together your first presentation and how to publish that first presentation out to BrightSign players. So those are our topics today. And we'll begin now with player basics. The BrightSign players consist of 3 models. Historically, we've shipped, up until about 3 months ago, we shipped players that were called the HD 1010, the HD 210, and the HD 110. Of course, I listed those in reverse order, the 110, 210, and 1010. And each player had a different set of I/O capabilities. These players have been updated, and starting about 3 months ago, we began shipping a new line, the Model 120, the HD 120, the Model HD 220, and the Model HD 1020. Now, an important thing to know is that these players are all equivalent in features. So, for example, where I used in the past the Model 110, I can now use the Model 120 with an identical feature set and identical capabilities. The same is true for the 210. It's been updated to the 220. And finally, the 1010 was updated to the 1020. We were careful to assure that these players were compatible with each other and compatible with BrightAuthor. So the result is you can build a network that is comprised of a mix of these players, both old and new, and you can publish the same presentation without any concern that a presentation, perhaps it was designed on the new player, will not run on the original player. It's simply not the case. Presentations designed for original players will run on the new player, and vice versa. Anything you build with the new player in mind can also run on one of the original players. Feature differences still apply. There are features in the 110 and the 120 in terms of I/O and capability that are unique to that model, just as there are feature differences between the 210, the 220, the 1010, and the 1020. So if you used features that depend on a model 1010 or 1020, of course, those features are not available in the other players, the 210 or the 220. So you have to pay attention, as you always did, to some of those differences, but you don't need to worry about growing a network that is a mix of old and new players, and so that's good news for everybody. The new model players are updated with new CPUs, a smaller footprint. They're physically smaller. They're the same height, but they're not quite as deep and they're not quite as wide, about an inch less wide and about an inch less deep. So you have a slightly smaller footprint. As you can see here in the drawing or in the picture, you'll note that the SD card slot and the status lights have moved around to the side of the new player, whereas in the original players, those were on the front. We wanted to get to a smaller player and to a lower cost, which we did, but we need to expose, of course, the same capabilities, and so the SD memory card slot simply moves around to the side, and the result is that the player is a little bit smaller. They're also less expensive. Where you did use the 1010 and now you can use a 1020, have the same capabilities at a lower price. Also, the new players are designed across a new chipset. The new media platform and the new CPU allow the player to perform more aggressively. It's faster with its updates. It's faster displaying images on the screen, particularly images like JPEG, where some decoding of the image is required, and decompression. You know, JPEG images are highly compressed, and it requires a CPU to decompress that image. The new player is quicker at doing that type of thing than the old player was. So an image that might take an extra moment or two to be displayed by the Model 1010 is displayed virtually instantly by the Model 1020. So something to keep in mind, the smaller form factor, a faster CPU, and a lower cost. So all good advantages on the new line. And feature equivalent. The three models, the 120, 220, and 1020, line up very, very similar to the original 110, 210, and 1010. There is a key difference. I'm going to start from the bottom and work up. The Model 1020 is our highly interactive player. It also has a network interface. This is the player people use when you need to build an interactive presentation. And by interactive, we mean that the player expects to receive input from an external device, such as a touchscreen or a barcode reader or perhaps a keyboard and mouse. This player has the I/O essential to accomplish that. It has a serial port that allows it to talk to external devices via serial. That could be a display, or some other device. It has GPIO, which stands for General Purpose I/O. GPIO is the oldest method of interactivity. This is simple contact closure for detecting a button that's been pressed, or a switch has been closed, or a relay has been opened or shut. The player can detect those events and can act accordingly. The Model 1020, like the 1010, also has a USB port. And the USB port can be used either to attach memory. We have customers that have attached to large hard disks to the sides of their players because they need extra capacity. But the USB port can also be used to interact with a touch screen or a barcode reader. Probably the most common touch screen interface today is via USB. And so a player that's working in concert with a touch screen will have two connections. You'll connect HDMI video to the display so the player's video out can be shown, but you'll also run a USB cable between the display and the player. And this is how the display will report back to the player that it's been touched and where it's been touched, and the player can act accordingly. So the Model 1020, like the Model 1010, includes a USB port for that purpose. There's also a network interface on this model, so the player can be updated remotely. It can be managed over a network. A network connection also allows players to communicate with each other. So one player can send a message to another player, and the behaviors on one player can affect behaviors on another. This is a very useful feature and allows synchronized and highly coordinated presentations to be built. We see this all the time in museums and in amusement parks where 10 or 15 or 20 players need to work together in concert and in tight coordination so that a complete user experience can be properly prepared and properly shown. Museums with 5 or 10 or 20 displays all working together to create an experience, either an art experience or historical experience. So the Model 1010 and the Model 1020 provide this I/O for interactivity. Moving up to the Model 220, or down in the product line, if you will, the Model 220 has none of the I/O that the Model 1010 and 1020 have. You'll see there's no serial port, there's no GPIO port, and there's no USB port. So there's no connectivity for serial devices, for buttons and contact closures, or for touch screens and barcode readers, or anything of that sort. The Model 220 does include a network interface, and therefore this player can be managed remotely, and in fact it can participate in coordinated presentations because the network connection is there. It allows the 220 to communicate with other players, and they can all work together to assure tight synchronization for a video wall or an amusement or museum presentation, but without GPIO, serial, or USB. This is a very popular player because it can be managed remotely. It can reside somewhere in the world and run very effective digital signage, a digital menu board, but generally in applications where no external I/O needs to take place. And then finally at the top here, you'll see our Model 1020. Now the Model 1020 does differ from the Model 1010 in one respect. The original Model 1010 was what we referred to as a simple looping player, a basic player. It had no I/O and it had no network interface. So you would insert a memory card with a presentation and the player would simply run that presentation in a continuous loop virtually forever until you turn power off and perhaps replace the card with a new presentation. In the new Model 1020 we've included, and you can see it here on the front, we've included GPIO. So the Model 10, this Model 120 is capable of interfacing with external buttons and relays and contact closures. This is proving a very, very useful feature for presentations that need to run standalone that are not going to be updated or managed over a network, but still add a measure of interactivity. A button press can trigger a different player behavior. So that's a difference in the Model 120 from the Model 110. The 110 did not have a GPIO port on the front. These are the basic players. You'll note that in the new line we don't include Wi-Fi versions. Those are coming when we finish the regulatory processes that are needed to ship a new Wi-Fi product. And so in the meantime, and until that's accomplished, we continue to make available the original Model 210W and the original Model 1010W. These players, at the same price as always, will give you the capabilities of a 210 or a 1010, but also include a Wi-Fi connection for those installation situations where a physical network connection would be difficult, but Wi-Fi meets the need. There's one more player you should be aware of. It's a newly announced player. The model AU320 was announced at Infocom last month in Las Vegas. This is an audio-only player. This player has no network, it has a network connection. It has no video output. The AU320 is intended to be used in situations where you need to provide ambient sound, voiceover, perhaps to a house audio system, or public announcements, but where there's no video component. Or perhaps to coordinate with other media players that have video out, but to provide an audio track or a carefully designed audio experience to run behind or around the other video players. It has a network interface and it has a serial interface to allow some interactivity with external devices. It has no GPIO and it has no USB, but in other respects behaves like a normal BrightSign player. It can be managed with BrightAuthor. It can live on the BrightSign network. It can be published to in the same fashion as the other players can be published to. And so in every respect, it is a BrightSign player, but without video output. There are multiple audio processors in this device, which allows us to do crossfades between audio streams. So you can have one audio file do a crossfade to another audio file, or you can blend a voiceover with background audio. And so the AU320 is a new BrightSign player and available to you in about 6 weeks. We expect availability on this player to begin in August of this year, August of 2012. So we're ready to begin our discussion of what do I do and what questions should I ask before I implement a BrightSign network system. Before you begin, you need to understand the answer to these questions. We'll need to talk about the type of memory card that your player will use. We don't include memory cards when we ship our players because there are just simply too many memory card options out there and different customers with different requirements. It would require us to stock just an incredible range of cards and to have those available. It simply works better for everybody to allow our customers to hop down to the nearest consumer electronics store and pick up the memory cards that meet their need at a price that works for them. When it comes to the size of the card and its format, you'll note, as we indicate here in the slide, that the size is at your discretion, but the format must be FAT. The FAT, or FAT file system, it stands for File Allocation Table. This is one of the early disk format types. It sort of predates Microsoft's proprietary NTFS or Apple's proprietary HFS. Microsoft's NTFS and Apple's HFS are both proprietary systems to those companies and to those systems and operating systems, so they don't work well in a third-party device like this. Instead, we're going with the more generic FAT format. It could be any of the FATs. You'll sometimes see FAT16 or FAT32. Those are fine as long as it's FAT. XFAT is not yet supported, but it's something we're looking at, and we may offer that in the future. So at present, the file format must be FAT, and that generates the occasional service call. It's every once in a while somebody will buy a memory card, put it in their computer, and format it, not paying attention to the fact that the card was just formatted with either Microsoft's or Apple's proprietary formats rather than the FAT format, and then trying to use that card in the player. The player acts as if no card is present. It simply won't react and can't read to the card and can't use the card, and the player exhibits the symptoms of a player without a card present. Yet you know full well you've put a card in it, and so we get a number of service calls, and upon further review, we find that the card is not formatted FAT. Simply format your card, your memory cards or memory devices, whether you're using an SD card or you're choosing to use the USB connection on a player to connect a USB memory stick or perhaps a USB hard drive. The key here is to format that memory device FAT. The FAT file format has a couple of limitations. Individual files cannot exceed 4 gigabytes, or gigabytes cannot exceed 4 gigabytes, and the total storage volume size cannot exceed 500 gigs. So half a terabyte is the maximum volume size, and 4 gigs is the maximum file size when using the FAT format. Rarely you'll encounter a piece of media, or perhaps a large video file, that is in fact larger than 4 gigs. And you're not going to be able to use that on a BrightSign player. You'll need to take that file to an external video editing system and cut it into 2 pieces. So the front piece and the back piece, or piece A and piece B. Now the good news is the player can play through those 2 segments seamlessly. So the playback experience is seamless and gives the appearance of being a single file. But the reality is, on your playlist and in your file management, it is 2 files. And it's simply a restriction of FAT that an individual media file cannot exceed 4 gigs. So keep that in mind. But otherwise, choose a size that makes sense to you. Recently in consumer electronics stores, I see 4 and 6 gig SD cards running at a very, very reasonable price, sometimes below $5 for a memory card, and I see up to 64 gigabyte cards available now. They're a little bit expensive. 32 is probably the biggest inexpensive card these days, and on a 32 gig card, there's room for literally hours and hours of high-definition video. So unless your project includes more than 5 or 6 hours of video, something in the 16 to 32 gigabyte size is going to be more than enough. You generally need to choose a card that's going to be large enough for the presentations you need to run, of course, and any future presentations you've scheduled, because the player will have those ready to go on the card as well. So if I have today's presentation running and I've also scheduled a presentation for tomorrow that's different, both those presentations will be pushed out to the player, and the player will have them both on the card. And though it's running today's presentation, it's also got tomorrow's residence. So make sure when you plan your card size, you take into account how many future presentations and their size you're likely to publish at a given moment. Otherwise, you'll run into capacity problems on your card. In the background, we take care of a process that we call garbage collection, and the player will, in this garbage collection mode, the player maintains awareness of files that are no longer needed and will delete them as space is required. So you don't need to worry about deleting old or bad presentations. We take care of that in the background, but you do need to focus on, how much capacity I need for today's and future presentations. Memory cards come in different speeds or qualities. This has reference to how fast the card is able to write data when you're saving to it, and how fast the card is able to read data out when you're pulling data off the card. This is known as the speed class, and you'll see the speed class on the card. It's normally a number in a circle. It's also often printed in the literature that associates the card. You'll see a card that's class 4 or class 6 or class 10. We recommend class 6 or faster, particularly in applications that require video. You need to be able to get the video file off the card fast enough to decode it and show it. So class 6 or faster. I noticed the other day when I was in my local consumer electronics store that it was hard to find anything slower than class 10. It seems that class 10 has become the new standard. No surprise, really, with the range of digital cameras, both video and still cameras that are out there in the market that want to be able to write images very, very fast as you're taking pictures. So card speeds are on the increase, and that's good for all of us. So class 6 or faster when you choose your card. We're frequently asked, here moving to the next point, what type of video file formats a player can handle. We have on our website a frequently asked question document that addresses this in a lot of detail. So I'm going to just touch on the highlights here. The key being that we support all the usual suspects. When it comes to still images, we support JPEGs, GIFs, bitmaps, and PNGs. It doesn't matter whether those were created on a Macintosh system or on a PC system. Those are very industry standard formats, and our player can use them just fine. The player does not take proprietary formats. A good example would be Adobe's Photoshop proprietary formats. Those are not supported by the player. But if you're using Photoshop, it's a very simple matter to take your finished image and export it as a JPEG or a PNG, a file format that our player easily handles. Keep in mind that JPEG images are highly compressed and require some CPU to decode. So bear that in mind when you're building your presentations. When it comes to video file formats, the same is true. We support the generic industry standard video formats, MPEG-1, MPEG-2, and MPEG-4 Part 10, also known as H264. H264 is becoming a very, very common video file format. It's used in almost all the video cameras that are consumer cameras out there today. And H264 is a video file format that's easy to create from inside virtually every video editing piece of software I've ever experienced. Certainly Final Cut Pro on the Macintosh, Adobe Premiere, Edius from Grass Valley, the Avid systems that are used in the high-end broadcast and studio production. All of these editing systems are capable of creating MPEG-1, MPEG-2, or MPEG-4 Part 10, also called H264. There are proprietary video formats out there that the player cannot handle, just as there are proprietary image formats. For example, if you're editing on an Avid, you'll encounter their file format known as DNX HD. It's a very high-quality video format for editing on an Avid system, but a DNX HD file will not play on a BrightSign player. The same is true on the Apple side. Apple has a proprietary codec that they use in Final Cut Pro called ProRes. Apple ProRes files, a very common file format when you're building and editing and working in the Final Cut Pro world, but it's a proprietary to Apple format, and it will not play on a BrightSign player. So whether you're building presentations or video on an Avid or on a Final Cut Pro or on a PC, you need to do your final save as or render out into a file format that is more generic and more industry standard, MPEG-1, MPEG-2, or MPEG-4 Part 10, also called x264. Now, those codecs, or those video file formats, are apart from the container type. A point of confusion when it comes to video files is often what type of container or what file extension will the player accept. Is it a .mov that an Apple product might create, or is it .mpg that a Windows machine might create? The .mpg or .mov or .wmv, if in the case of Windows, those dot extensions have reference to the container. Think of it as a jar, and the shape of the jar and the size and capabilities of the jar are one thing, but what you put into the jar is something else entirely. So, I remember as a kid we picked apricots in the backyard and we would can apricots, but then later we would can peaches. We would use the same jars, and we'd have jars of apricots and we'd have jars of peaches, always with the same jar. Well, the same thing can happen in computer media file types. I can have a .mov out of my Macintosh created with Final Cut Pro, but inside that .mov I might have MPEG-1, MPEG-2, or H.264. So it's an MOV, but what's in the MOV is just as important as how it's wrapped or how it's presented to the machine. We support the generic and more industry standard container types, but we don't support proprietary container types. So we take the .ts or .mov or .mpg or .m2t. These are detailed in the frequently asked questions document. But regardless the container type, the actual contents of the container has to be MPEG-1, MPEG-2, or MPEG-4 Part 10, H.264. Moving on, how will I update contents? This is an important question to ask because fundamentally this has direct bearing on how you will set up your player. Really, there's two ways to update a player's contents, either to physically deliver a new memory card to the player. We call that standalone, or local file publishing. Or you're going to update your player over an Ethernet connection that may or may not include a connection to the big wide world of the Internet. So that would be a network publishing method. If you're publishing via the network, there are things about that network you're going to need to know. And that's what we refer to in the next bullet item here on this slide. We need to know if your recording, if your network settings will be handled DHCP, or if your network settings will be handled manually or static. DHCP refers to a Dynamic Host Control Protocol. This is an automated method for assigning an IP address to a new device on a network. So on a network that supports DHCP, I don't need to worry about IP addresses or anything behind that. I simply connect my device, and it negotiates with the network what IP address and subnet mask and so forth that device will operate on. But there are plenty of network environments where that negotiation is not possible because it's not supported. We refer to those as static environments. And in the case of a static network, the player will need to be programmed in advance with the IP address, the subnet space, the gateway IP address, and DNS server address information. DNS stands for Domain Name Servers. So you will need to know that information in advance, and the IT department who have created that network and who are managing that network will know the answers to these questions, and you'll need to coordinate with them to find out how your player or players should be set up. From a performance and an operational point of view, it does not matter even a little bit which of these addressing schemes are used, whether it's DHCP or static. As long as it's properly configured, you're going to be able to communicate with your player and manage its use. So these are questions you'll need to ask in advance, and you'll need to understand in advance before you even begin to move forward with your BrightSign player. It's time now to talk about downloading and installing BrightAuthor and configuring BrightAuthor. I've launched our website, the brightsign.biz. You can see our URL here in the corner, www.brightsign.biz. We're not a .com, we're a .biz, so there you go when you find us. And we make our software available at no charge. You can find it from our homepage at the Support tab. When you click on Support, you'll see that there are numerous downloadable objects here. And at the top of the page, you'll find the player firmware. Here's firmware for our new model 120, 220, and 1020, version 4.0.13 or 4.1.35. These are player firmware. This is not the BrightAuthor application. And occasionally we'll get a support call from someone who's downloaded player firmware and is having a hard time installing it on their machine, believing that rather they've downloaded BrightAuthor. That's not the case. So just scroll down the page, get past the player firmware, and you'll find BrightAuthor available for download. And there's always generally one or two versions there for download. Here I see 3. We have an official release from April 10th of this year. We have a beta release from June 12th of this year. And we've got a beta release from earlier, March. And you'll note that in all cases we show the minimum player firmware version that's required if you're going to use this version of BrightAuthor. And we've got some data about what this new version offers. The 3.2.0.4 is the version that I'm running on my machine. You simply choose Download Now, save that file, and run it. You'll get your typical installer for your Windows machine. We're occasionally asked if BrightAuthor is Macintosh compatible. Unfortunately, it's not. And at present, we have no plans to build a Mac version of the application. However, BrightAuthor runs perfectly well on a Mac, but in one of those Windows emulation environments, such as Boot Camp or Parallels. There are several that will allow you to run a PC application on your Mac. And if you've got and are familiar with one of those, feel free to use it. BrightAuthor will run just fine. But download BrightAuthor, the version that is interesting to you. Again, like I say, I'm using 3.2.04 on my machine. Here's the thing to be aware of. You'll note that we mention firmware versions here that are required. This is the catch. If I go to a version of BrightAuthor, for example, this version 3.2.04, it will be necessary to update my players to the minimum firmware version that is companion to this BrightAuthor. When we release a new version of BrightAuthor, it's generally new features and bug fixes that are supported. Well, in order for those new features and bug fixes to be properly rendered over on the player side, there's almost always a companion player firmware update. So keep in mind that if you update BrightAuthor, you're specifying, or you're also making the decision to update the firmware in your players. If the version of BrightAuthor you're using, along with the version of firmware that you have installed in your players, are all working fine and meet your need, then I recommend staying with that version until there's an actual new feature need to upgrade. Then make a decision to move to a new version of BrightAuthor, realizing that that will also require that you publish new firmware out to your players. Now, the good news is updating the firmware on a player in the field is easily done. It's easily done remotely. There's no need to go visit the player if the player's on a network and you're managing it remotely. But it's something that will certainly have to be done if you update BrightAuthor. So from our main website, go to the Support tab and you'll find these downloads here. Once you've downloaded the BrightAuthor installer, simply run the installer. If you have a prior version, we recommend uninstalling the prior version first before proceeding with the new version. Settings are maintained. You won't lose anything that you've done, but it's good practice to uninstall the old version first before going forward with the install of a new version. All right, I've installed my version of BrightAuthor, And I'm going to move to a volume on my machine here where I have content ready to go for today's session. And before I go too far, what I'd like to show you, we're going to talk now about how to configure a player, and then we'll talk about publishing a presentation for the first time. But a player configuration is on the Tools menu. But before I go there, let's look quickly at the help about BrightAuthor, and you'll see the version that you're running. I'm running version 3.2.0.4. And so if you see differences between how my BrightAuthor looks and yours, those are probably the result of a version difference. The differences would be subtle, but don't be surprised. I need to configure my player for the very first use, and I need to do this really before I build any presentations. We got to get our player up and running and ready to go. And remember, there are two cases where a player might be updated. I'm either updating a player manually and standalone, or I'm updating a player over the network. Well, if I'm updating a player over a network, that implies knowledge about how my network is configured. It also implies getting BrightAuthor property set up to work in that network environment. Something that's often missed in a BrightAuthor installation is here on the Edit menu, settings and choices about how BrightAuthor will work. Most of these have to do with defaults. You know, the default audio volume, for example, is 100%. Default image is 6 seconds on the timeline with no effect for transition, and so forth. There are a handful of defaults here that you can go through and manage. I like, for example, the clock settings that are available to me. I can choose the language that I want my clock to be displayed in. I can also customize how the clock behaves and looks on the screen. You know, in many parts of the world, we order our date differently. In North America, we have a pattern where we show the month, then the day, then the year. But in other parts of the world, that's done differently. You might want the year first, followed by the month, and then followed by the day. And so you can, by ordering these variables in this field, change how the player displays month and date information. You can also change the language, the actual text that's used when it displays a month or a day. Maybe I am working in Spanish, and I would prefer, rather than July, I would prefer the Spanish word for July, which is Julio, you know, in which case I simply make the change here to update how the date and the month will be displayed on the screen. So July will be my choice here. I'm going to stick with the North American conventions. The same is true for time. I can choose how time will be displayed, whether I'm using a 24-hour clock or a 12-hour clock, whether I'm going to display AM or PM. So these are available for management within the preferences. The key item here I wanted to get to, though, is the networking tab. Because there are multiple network methods for communicating with the BrightSign player, you can enable or disable those in BrightAuthor. It's helpful to be able to do this because if I don't use a particular method, I can essentially disappear it from the application so that I'm not constantly bothered by it. If I'm publishing via a BrightSign Network subscription, there's no reason to be bothered with other networking publishing choices in the dialogues and the screens that later follow in BrightAuthor. So every once in a while we get a call into the support line. I want to use simple file networking, but for some reason it's not showing up on my screen. How do I get to it? Almost always the case is simply a matter of whether or not the option has been enabled here in BrightAuthor. For our call today, I'm going to enable them all so that I can quickly touch on them all. But the reality is you probably use one or another of these. You'll notice some additional tabs appeared here on the screen by virtue of the fact that I had enabled those features. Something else that BrightAuthor does is now that I've enabled work over the BrightSign network, it's offering me an option to sign in to my BrightSign network account. Now, if you're not using the BrightSign network, you won't have an account. And you'd probably go disable that on the settings screen so if you're not given this choice. But I do have one. In fact, I'm going to take a moment and sign into it so that I'll be able to use it later here in our discussion. and sign in. I've now signed into the BrightSign Network account. And I know I'm signed in because on the Tools menu, my choice is now Sign Out. Whereas before it was Sign In, it's now Sign Out. So I know I am, in fact, signed in. So our objective is to set up a BrightSign player. For security reasons, a player cannot be communicated with over a network until it's set up. You simply cannot plug a player into the network and just expect to find it. That would be a security breach and a security problem. So you need to configure a player for first use on the network. Now, once it's configured and working, you'll be able to manage it remotely in every respect. But until you've configured it for that very first use, you won't be able to find the player, publish anything to it, or use it really at all. Setting up a player is a choice from the Tools menu called Set Up a BrightSign Unit. And making that choice brings this screen forward, and you'll see here the configuration choices that are available to me. You can give the player a name and a description. The name and description are entirely up to you. You can choose the time zone for the player. A player that is connected to the network knows what time it is. And it's important for a player to know what time it is because we give you the ability to schedule presentations to run on a certain date and time. Occasionally someone will call and ask why their player is not showing content. The screen is always dark even though they've scheduled something to run today. Why isn't it running? And often the answer is simply the player has no network connection. The player doesn't know what time it is, and therefore the player cannot follow a schedule. Seems simple here when we talk about it, but the reality is we get more than a handful of calls on this subject. So choosing a time zone and choosing a time server. You're free to use ours, time.brightsignetwork.com, and it's the default time server for a BrightSign player, but it's not required that you use ours. You could enter somebody else's time server or your own if you use one, but ours is available. Now, to see our time server, you'll need an internet connection. Obviously, our time server is not installed on your network. So if your player does not, maybe your player is connected to your local area network, but is unable to see the big wide world of the public internet, your player still will not know what time it is unless you point it to a local time server. And that's a case where your local IT folks, again, can tell you what time server they want you to use. But by default, a BrightSign player is going to try to connect to the BrightSign time server, and worldwide all BrightSign players know what time it is. This section on the screen has to do with setting up an IP address. As we talked before, you can either get your IP address automatically, which follows the DHCP protocol we discussed earlier, or you can enter an IP address manually, in which case your IT personnel will give you the information that you need to place in these fields. I've entered an IP address here, as you can see, 192.168.1.2, a subnet mask, a default gateway, and a broadcast IP address. But these will not work, almost certainly not work on your network. You'll need to coordinate with your IT folks what settings should go in these fields. Let's set mine for automatic. If you're on a Wi-Fi system, then you have the option to choose wireless, in which case you need to put in advance here the SSID, which is the broadcast name of your wireless address, and the security key. But or if you're just going with a physical connection, choose wired, and this all disappears. Here's where I have the option to specify a firmware update. Remember our discussion about firmware, that it's necessary to have a minimum version of firmware installed given the version of BrightAuthor you're running, and I can include that firmware as part of my player setup. Now I don't ever have to worry about it again. I've updated my player, it's running the right firmware, and I'm ready to go. So on the old models, the 110, 210, and so forth, you choose the firmware for that player, or if you're running one of the new players, the 120, 220, 1020, you can choose that firmware and say OK. When you choose to update firmware, you'll get a little asterisk down here by specify firmware update, just as a visual cue that a firmware update has been selected. Otherwise, you can choose not to update firmware, and those asterisks will disappear. So, with a firmware update selected, remember now, having updated firmware, I won't need to do that again. Players don't forget their firmware. It's just something you do once. I now have the option to set up my player for the networking method that I'm going to use. If it's standalone, then this is the last and only choice I need to make. I leave everything else empty, and I simply say create the setup files. Standalone means you're not updating your player over the network. You'll only update your player by bringing new memory cards to it. So with this configuration ready to go, I choose Create Setup Files. I perhaps make a folder on my desk where these files will go. Or I could simply choose to browse directly on my machine to the drive that is my SD card. I don't have an SD card on my machine, but if I did, it would show here. I could simply select that SD card and publish directly to the card. In my case, I'm going to publish to a folder on my disk, on my hard disk, on my desktop. I'm going to say OK, and the configuration files are written off to that folder. When I've got everything set here and I'm ready to publish, I simply say Create Setup Files. I choose the location where I want to publish these. In this case, I'm publishing to a folder on my hard disk. I could have chosen to go to the SD card directly if I had one inserted in my machine, which I don't. But I'm going to choose a folder here on my disk, in my desktop actually, called Setup. I'm going to write the setup files to that location. Once that's done, I say OK, and I'm all set. Those setup files have been written to a folder on my hard disk. They can be copied to an SD card and put to the player, and the player configuration will proceed. I put the card in the player, turn the player on, and I'll soon get a message that says, setup is complete. You may now remove the card. However, if I'm configuring my player for publishing method over the network, then I need to make some different choices. Remember, I enabled all 4 network publishing methods on my copy of BrightAuthor, so all 4 network publishing methods appear here. Now, we could spend a lot of time on details about these. That's an advanced topic. I'm not going to go into tremendous detail on these publishing methods. Simply at this point, we're going to choose and see how they appear if I choose one. Let's fix everything else here. Raise player, raise player. Everything else is how I want it to be. So local file networking is the method that publishes over my local area network. And when I choose local file networking, it forces me to enable the player's own local web server and forces me to assign a username and password. Now, I can type anything in here I wish, username and password are at my discretion, but I have to do it. And that's what allows me to retain control of my player. Imagine that I've got players on my local area network, but so do you. And the two of us are working together, but I've got responsibility for one set of players, and you have responsibility for a different set of players. You don't want me accidentally changing your players, and I certainly don't want you accidentally changing mine. So this username and password is what assures that my copy of BrightAuthor can only talk to my players. And your copy of BrightAuthor will only talk to yours because you will have certainly created a different username and password for your players. Now, when I go to find my players on my local area network, I'll only find those that match the username and password that I've created here, and therefore I will only be able to publish to my players. If, on the other hand, I choose to publish via the BrightSign network, remember I'm already signed in. I signed in earlier. And so BrightAuthor knows the BrightSign network account that I belong to, and therefore knows already the BrightSign network account that this player should be assigned to. So when I choose to publish via the BrightSign network, I get some choices here, as, for example, how often the BrightSign player should communicate with the servers, and which group of players this player should, by default, drop into. I've named my group the default group, and so simply by choosing this and a group of players, I'm done. I don't need to say anything more. I don't need to remember my account name, username, or password for the BrightSign network because BrightAuthor already knows it, and BrightAuthor is ready to put that into the players as it goes. Now, the last method here for publishing is called simple file networking. Simple file networking it represents the case where I'm publishing my presentation to a server someplace, but it's my own server. It's my own storage that my own players can see. And so I'm going to write my presentations there, and I need to tell the player where there is. I need to give the player the URL that will take the player to that server and into the right folder where the player will be able to find the presentation that I want it to find. That's what we refer to when we mean simple file networking. It means you have a server someplace with a URL that you can publish to, and it's going to be http:// www, or an IP address, and a folder name, or something like that, where your server folder can be found. Now, I can't tell you in advance what this is going to be because everybody who uses this method has something different. But you work together with your local IT folks to create a location on your network that can be found via an HTTP URL. That's the key. It's not a simple network share. It's what we call a web share. So once you've got that information from your IT folks, you can publish to it. It's at this point in setting up our player that we're telling the player that this is where it should go to look, and here's how frequently it should check to see if something is there new for it. So very simply, local file networking, BrightSign network, or simple file networking are your network methods, or you can publish standalone. We're going to go BrightSign network in my case because that's what I'm using, and everything else can be left alone. Defaults on rate limiting. This is an advanced subject, so for now we'll just simply take the defaults, and in a future webinar we'll talk in detail about what's happening here. But go with the defaults and say create your setup files. I'm going to put them in the same setup folder I did before, and that is ready to go to my BrightSign player. My player will then boot, connect to my BrightSign network account, and wait for me to publish a presentation. So now let's talk about building our first presentation and publishing that presentation. This won't take long. This is actually a very straightforward topic. We choose to build a new presentation, give the presentation a name, and choose where you're going to store it. I store all my presentations in a folder here I call BrightAuthor Projects. And BrightAuthor Projects, I choose the player that I'm working with. I choose the video output that I'm going with, whether it's VGA or HDMI. Notice that when I choose VGA, for example, my palette of available screen resolutions is different than when I choose HDMI. If I choose HDMI, I have a much deeper set of choices. All the broadcast choices are available to me. The most traditional is 1080i, which is right here, 1920 by 1080 by 5994i, or in Europe it would be 60i. I should say in former PAL countries it would be 60i. In former NTSC countries it's probably 5994i. But either way, these two represent what we often refer to as 1080i. Or here's 720p, same situation. The NTSC countries would use 1280 by 720 by 5994p. P stands for progressive, I stands for interlace. Or 1280 by 720 by 60p. These would be the so-called 720p or so-called 1080i. I'm going to choose 1080i and hit create. We give you some choices of layouts, multi-zone layouts, or others are ready to go. I'm simply going to choose full screen. And now with my full screen presentation here ready to build, I'm ready to put items on the timeline. Now, an advanced topic would be working with this layout and creating different zones and laying out different zones for different uses. We'll cover a lot of that in a future webinar, but it's sufficient at this point to say that I can build any zone on the screen anywhere I want, and I can add zones for images or for other uses, put those on the screen anywhere I need them to be, and build out a multi-zone presentation. Today's presentation, though, is simply going to be a single full-screen presentation. I'm going to go to playlist editing mode, and I simply put my items on the screen that I want to display. And notice I'm putting a mix of still images and video files on this playlist, and I'm arranging them in any order I wish. I can move these around. I can delete them by hitting the delete key. I can put these in any order I want them to run. Here I've got a movie trailer from the old Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows movie, a picture I took of a lighthouse in Santa Cruz, California, some water at Monterey Beach. Here's a movie trailer. Bring this movie up here, and let me get one more movie on the timeline. Here's a movie trailer from Secretariat, the movie that ran in the theaters not long ago. Okay, so here I've got, looks like 8 items on my timeline. This timeline will simply play in order forever. The still images, when I look at them, I can right-click and choose Edit, and I see how long that still image will be on the screen. I can do, by holding down my Control key, I can select multiple images, and I can simultaneously edit all of their properties. So now when I get to this slide in, I want to fade from black. Right, fade from background colors black by default, so we'll go that way. All right, now I get a video image. This video file will fade to black, and then this graphic will fade up from black. It'll stay on the screen for 10 seconds, then it'll fade to black, and my new video file will begin, and so forth. So I get a nice, pleasant set of transitions going on here, and it's ready to publish. Let's save it. So now it's saved. Saving a presentation locally, remember I'm going to publish via the BrightSign network. Saving a presentation locally does not make it available up on the network to be published out to a player. I need to take one more step, and that's what this button here is all about, upload to the network. Okay, ready to go. So now we move to the Publish tab. And here are my publishing methods: publishing to local storage, publish via the BrightSign network, publish via the local network, publish via Simple File Network. I'm going to choose to publish in this case using the BrightSign network. And when I select the BrightSign network, I see the current schedule, which I can delete by simply hitting the delete key. And now I've got a clear calendar. Here's the presentation I just built, Ray's Bogus Presentation. If I had not uploaded it to the BrightSign network, it would not be available to me here on this list to publish. And notice here I'm also choosing my player groups. I could have more than one group of players. I've only got 2 groups right now, and I'm going to use this default presentation group to publish Ray's Bogus Presentation. When I drop something on the timeline or in the calendar, it will run at that time and date. So Tuesday, July 3rd, well, that's already in the past, so that would be dumb. But let's move forward in time to the 10th of July. Nah, actually, let's go back to this week. Those of you who are watching this later will certainly understand that I recorded this on July 5th. So let's move this to today, and now it will run today at noon from 12 to 1. And I can adjust that to run it for any length, or I can simply double-click and I can manually type in the time I want it to run. And I can go right down to the minute. I can go, I want this to run from 12:01 p.m. until 2:13 p.m., and that's acceptable. It'll take that. I can say OK, and that will be the result, from 12:01 to 2:13. But also it might be that I simply, deleting that, I'm going to bring it back on here from scratch, double-click. I can just say run all day, every day, and cheat. And that fills the entire schedule, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, out into infinity with this one presentation. And if I were now to publish this by hitting publish, this presentation and its associated data will be sent out to all the players in this group. It's been published. Let's go check the group. Again, I'm still using the BrightSign network. And one of the features of the BrightSign network is this ability here to manage and to look at. Let's see if my copy of Bright Author will catch up with me here. Here we go. On the Manage tab, I can see my groups of players. I have no players in this group, but I do have a player in this group. It's Ray's office, a player that's sitting in my desk. This player is happy. It's in a happy place. It's checking in and running as it should. It's supposed to check in every 5 minutes. It last checked in at 3 minutes after 10 this morning. You can see here that it's July 5th at 10:03 California time. And in just a few minutes, well, within 5 minutes, it will check in again. When it does, it will learn that it should no longer be running this presentation that I call Wagner Fades, but instead should run a Ray's bogus presentation. And when that takes place, I'll be able to right-click and monitor the download progress. I'll be able to see all the resources, the files and metadata and other items that need to download to the player, and I'll be able to see their status and know that they're downloaded or downloading. And when the player actually begins to run the presentation, the active presentation here will switch from Wagner Fades to Ray's bogus presentation. But at a glance here, I can see that this player is alive and well. It's checking in as it should. In fact, I'll do a quick refresh because it should have checked in again by now. Not quite. It's going to check in here any minute, probably within the next minute or so. We'll come back and look at that perhaps later. So, I published. Were I to choose to publish to local storage, it's very much the same, except now we're not dependent on anything that's up on the servers. Here are all the projects that I could publish from, and I can simply say publish and write them out to the SD card that I have put in my player and walk that SD card over to my player, and away we go. So we've covered the basics, as I said we would. We've talked about basics, player, the different types of players, the model 120, 220, and 1020. We've talked about installing Bright Author software, configuring the application, and configuring a player for first use. We've talked about building our first presentation, and we've published our first presentation. Those are the topics we intended to address in today's webinar. I really appreciate that you took the time to join us. I hope that this presentation was helpful and productive for you. And please send us your feedback as we're preparing additional topics. We certainly need to go into more detail on some of these other capabilities, and we'll do that in a future webinar. Thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you for joining us today. And please be in touch and let us know what else we can do to be of assistance.